The office was quiet in the way it only gets after 9 at night, when even the cleaning crew has gone home and the elevators stop answering right away. I sat at my desk with 3 seating charts spread out like a losing hand of cards, trying to figure out how to keep a bride's mother and her ex-husband's new wife on opposite sides of a ballroom without either of them noticing they'd been managed. This was the part of my job nobody saw. Not the flowers, not the string quartet, not the moment the doors open and everyone gasps. Just me, a laptop, and a spreadsheet named Final, Seating V14. I heard her before I saw her. Seraphina Rowe didn't walk so much as arrive, heels announcing her a full second before she appeared in the doorway of my office, one hand resting on the frame like she owned it. Which, in fairness, she did. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question. She never asked things she could observe for herself. "Table 12 is a war zone," I said, not looking up. "I'm negotiating a ceasefire." She didn't laugh. Seraphina rarely laughed, not out loud, though sometimes I caught the corner of her mouth doing something complicated when she thought no one was paying attention. Tonight she looked tired in a way she usually didn't let herself look, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes instead of on the surface. "I need you to come to a wedding with me tomorrow," she said. "Not as my employee, as my date." I set my pen down. "Is this a test? Are you testing whether I'll say something inappropriate under pressure?" "I don't test people, Mira. I ask them things directly, and I expect a direct answer. Then the direct answer is that I think you're joking, and you don't joke, so now I'm confused." She stepped into the office fully and closed the door behind her, which she never did. The click of it felt louder than it should have. "Amara canceled 2 hours ago," she said. "Family emergency, apparently, though I suspect it has more to do with the woman she's currently texting than any actual emergency. I'm supposed to be at the Whitfield Marchetti wedding tomorrow at 4, and I refuse to walk in there alone. You've walked into 100 weddings alone. Not this one." Something in the way she said it made me stop reaching for a joke. I had worked for Seraphina Rowe for 3 years, long enough to know the difference between her controlled voice and her guarded one. And this was the guarded one, in thin ice over something she didn't want me to see the shape of. "Celeste will be there," I said, because I did the math the way I did math on every seating chart, matching names to old wounds, with someone new. Seraphina's expression didn't change, which told me everything. "You know the venue," she said, steady again, back in control of her own voice. "You know the timeline. You know Diane Whitfield's entire extended family, and exactly which cousins can't be within 20 feet of each other. It would be practical." "Practical?" I repeated. "Yes. You could bring literally anyone from the office and call it practical. You didn't have to come down here at 9 at night and ask me specifically." For a moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, I understood that this was as close as Seraphina Rowe came to admitting she needed something. Not wanted, needed. She was not a woman who asked for help, and here she was, asking. "Fine," she said finally, and there was the faintest crack of something almost embarrassed underneath the composure. "You're the only person whose presence doesn't make everything worse. Is that a good enough reason?" I thought about my empty apartment, my dead-end Saturday, and the particular ache of watching my boss ask me for something with her guard half down. I thought about how long it had been since anyone had looked at me like their evening depended on my answer. "I'll come," I said, "but you're not allowed to hold my hand under the table and pretend it's for practicality." The corner of her mouth did the complicated thing again. "Noted," she said, and left before I could ask anything else. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at table 12, no longer thinking about seating charts at all. I called my friend Della, who worked in catering, and had known me since my first disastrous week at Rowan Vale, because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. "She asked you to be her date," Della repeated, in the tone of someone testing whether the sentence made more sense out loud than it had in her head. "The Ice Duchess asked you to a wedding." "As practicality," I said, "because I know the venue." "Mira, you know 12 venues. She could have asked literally any of us. She asked you specifically, at 9 at night, with her office door closed." Della let that sit for a second. "Do you want it to be more than practical?" I want to survive tomorrow without embarrassing myself. That's not a no. It wasn't, and we both knew it. And Della had the good grace not to push further, though she did make me promise to call her the second the wedding was over, which felt, at the time, like an unnecessary precaution. I should explain something about myself, because it matters for what happened next. I am not a woman who discovers her attraction to women in dramatic, blinking in the sunlight fashion. I've known who I am since I was 17, and I've dated women since college, some of them wonderful. One of them who left me convinced that love was mostly a performance people gave up on once the audience went home. Her name was Devon, and she used to tell me I was easy to love, which sounds like a compliment until you understand what she meant by it, that I required no effort, made no demands, and was therefore infinitely replaceable. She left me for someone louder, someone who made her work for it. I spent the better part of 2 years afterward believing that being easy to love was the same thing as not being worth choosing. So when I say that some quiet, self-protective part of me had noticed Seraphina Rowe for longer than I wanted to admit, understand that I noticed the way a woman notices a cliff edge. Beautiful, dangerous, not something you walk toward on purpose. The next morning, a garment bag arrived at my apartment before I'd even finished my coffee. Inside was a dress the color of a forest at dusk, deep green silk that would probably cost more than my rent, with a note in Seraphina's precise handwriting. Thought this would suit you. No obligation to wear it. I stood in my kitchen holding the dress and feeling something twist in my chest that I recognized as danger. Being handed things, being outfitted, being arranged, that was Devon's whole methodology, dressing me up like I was a doll she could perfect. I was not going to let my boss do the same thing, even dressed up as kindness. I texted her, "Thank you, but I have my own dress. See you at 3. She didn't respond for almost an hour, which for Seraphina Rowe, a woman who answered emails at 2 in the morning, was practically a soliloquy. When she finally did, it was 3 words. Good. See you. I went to the little boutique 2 blocks from my apartment, the one run by a woman named Priya, who had fitted me for exactly 1 wedding before. My cousin's, 3 years ago, back when I still believed in the institution unreservedly. I tried on 4 dresses before I found the one, midnight blue with a neckline that said, "Confident." Rather than available? Fabric that moved like water when I turned. Priya pinned the waist and asked who the lucky date was. "My boss," I said. "It's complicated." "It's always complicated when it's the boss," Priya said, mouth full of pins, and I decided not to examine that sentence too closely. By the time I left the boutique, the day had turned into a blur of last-minute venue calls, confirming that the ballroom's ancient sound system had finally been replaced, that the florist understood white roses meant white roses, and not mostly white with some cream, that Diane Whitfield's father and his second wife had been placed at tables that could not see each other without turning around. I was, for a few hours, purely Mira Ellis, senior project coordinator, and it was a relief to disappear into competence. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. The venue was a converted train station turned luxury hotel, all soaring ceilings and gold light, the kind of place that made ordinary people whisper without meaning to. I arrived at 3, hair done, dress on, feeling like an imposter in my own body. I had walked into this exact ballroom a dozen times as staff, invisible in the particular way service people are invisible, clipboard in hand, earpiece in, moving along the walls instead of through the center of the room. Walking in as a guest felt like wearing someone else's skin. Seraphina was waiting near the entrance in a black gown so severe and so perfect it looked like it had been poured onto her, her dark hair swept back, a single sapphire pendant at her throat. She looked, as always, like winter given a body. When she saw me, something happened to her face that she caught, and smoothed over almost before I registered it, but not quite fast enough. Her eyes moved once, slowly, from my shoulders to the hem of the dress, and came back up to my face, like she was recalibrating something. "You look," she said, and stopped. "Practical?" I offered. I was going to say devastating, actually, but if you'd prefer practical, I can work with that. I felt heat climb my neck and busied myself checking my clutch for absolutely nothing, because I did not trust my own face not to give me away. "Rules," she said, offering her arm as we walked toward the ballroom doors. "Diane's Aunt Constance will ask invasive questions. Answer none of them honestly. Her Uncle Robert will try to talk business with me for 40 minutes if given the opportunity. If he corners me, interrupt, and whatever Celeste says to you, ignore it. She is very good at making people feel small, and she will try it on you specifically because you're with me. Understood. Anything else?" She glanced down at me, and for one unguarded second, the winter in her eyes went soft. "Stay close," she said. "That's all." The ballroom was everything the wedding industry promised and rarely delivered. Candlelight bouncing off polished marble, white roses cascading down every surface, rain beginning to streak the tall windows in long silver lines, a string quartet playing something that sounded like held breath. Diane Whitfield floated through the room in ivory silk, radiant, oblivious to the small war I had waged on her behalf over seating charts. Seraphina moved through the crowd like she'd been built for exactly this, greeting people with brief, precise warmth, and every single time someone's attention drifted toward me with the particular curiosity reserved for the unfamiliar, her hand found the small of my back, grounding, present, before I even had time to feel exposed. "This is Mira," she said, over and over, to men in expensive suits and women dripping in old family jewelry. "She keeps my company from falling apart." "My employee." "Never." "My coordinator." "Just my Mira," offered like a fact that needed no further explanation. When Constance the aunt asked, with the studied innocence of someone who already knew the answer she wanted, how long Seraphina and I had been together, Seraphina answered before I could stumble over anything. "Not as long as I would have liked," she said smoothly, and steered the conversation elsewhere before Constance could follow up, leaving me standing there trying to figure out if that had been a lie for the room or something closer to the truth. I was midway through a glass of champagne I hadn't asked for, appearing at my elbow the moment my hand went empty, because apparently Seraphina Rowe tracked my glass level the way she tracked vendor timelines, when the temperature of the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees, though nothing had physically changed except that a woman had entered. Celeste Armand was beautiful in the specific, engineered way of people who had spent a lifetime being looked at. Pale gold hair, a red dress that made a point of being the only red dress in a sea of jewel tones, a diamond on her hand that caught candlelight like it had rehearsed the movement. Beside her, a woman I didn't recognize, younger, soft-eyed, clearly besotted, clearly unaware of the history walking into the room with her. "Seraphina Rowe," Celeste said, arriving in front of us like she'd been announced. "Still doing weddings for other people. How very on-brand. Celeste." Seraphina's voice was flat, controlled, a locked door. "You look well." "I am well." Celeste's eyes slid to me, cataloging, assessing, the way I imagined she assessed everything, for weakness, for use. "And who's this?" "Mira Ellis," I said, before Seraphina could answer for me. "I work with Seraphina." "Work with," Celeste repeated, something amused and cruel flickering behind her eyes. "How diplomatic." "Seraphina's very good at finding people who work with her instead of people who love her. It's efficient, I suppose. No messy feelings to manage." She turned back to Seraphina, voice dropping into something almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You always did treat people like appointments, darling. Punctual, useful, easily rescheduled." I watched something flicker across Seraphina's face, there, and gone so fast that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. I was paying close attention. It looked like an old wound being pressed on purpose. "If you'll excuse us," Seraphina said, and her voice didn't shake. Not exactly, but there was a thinness to it now. Ice stretched over something moving underneath. We stepped away. and I felt the whole encounter sitting in the air between us like smoke that hadn't cleared. The quartet shifted into something slower, something with a heartbeat instead of a rhythm, and couples began drifting toward the center of the floor. Seraphina turned to me. Up close, under the candlelight, I could see that her composure had a hairline crack in it, small enough that only someone standing exactly where I was standing could have seen it. "Dance with me," she said. Quiet, careful, like we're dating. I should have laughed. I should have made a joke about scope creep, about how this had definitely not been in the original job description. Instead, I found myself setting down my champagne glass and taking her offered hand, because some part of me, the part that had noticed her the way you notice a cliff edge, had been waiting for exactly this without admitting it to myself. Her hand settled at my waist like it had always belonged there. Mine found her shoulder, the fabric of her gown cool and slick beneath my fingers. We began to move, slow, careful, performing the shape of intimacy for a room that was absolutely, unmistakably watching. "Look at me like you like me," she murmured, close to my ear, close enough that I felt the words more than heard them. "Celeste is 3 tables to your left. She's watching." Bossy, even during a fake romance, I said, and felt rather than saw her almost smile. I contain multitudes. We turned, slow circles under gold light, rain streaking the windows behind us, and for a while, it was easy to pretend it was exactly what she'd asked for: a performance, choreography, a favor between colleagues. Her hand tightened slightly at my waist as we turned. My fingers found the fine fabric at her shoulder blade and felt the tension there, coiled tight. And without thinking about it, I smoothed my thumb once against it, an instinct left over from 100 crises I'd talked her down from at the office. I felt her exhale, slow, like something in her had been given permission to loosen. "You're allowed to breathe," I said. "Even during choreography. I am breathing. You're doing that thing where you breathe like it's a task on a list." That got the real thing, not the almost smile, but an actual, small, startled laugh. Gone as quickly as it came, but I had heard it, and something in my chest turned over at having caused it. We danced longer than one song should have allowed. The quartet slid from one slow piece into another without pause, and neither of us moved to step apart, both of us pretending we hadn't noticed the music had changed twice now. Her hand slid, infinitesimally, from the correct formal placement at my waist to something looser, warmer, her palm flat against the small of my back like she'd forgotten, for a moment, that this was supposed to be technique and not truth. "Seraphina, you're not performing anymore." Her eyes came up to mine, and whatever careful instruction she'd been about to give me, about the angle of our bodies, or the placement of our hands, died somewhere behind her teeth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The room kept existing around us, candlelight, rain, 100 watching eyes, Celeste's red dress somewhere at the edge of my vision. But none of it felt as real as the space between Seraphina's mouth and mine, which had somehow, without either of us deciding it, gotten smaller. "Are you still pretending?" she asked, so quietly I almost missed it under the music. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not with any honesty I trusted myself to survive saying out loud in the middle of a stranger's wedding, with my boss's hand at the small of my back, and her ex-girlfriend 3 tables away, and every possible reason in the world why this was a terrible idea, sitting right behind my ribs where my heart used to be quiet and uncomplicated. The silence stretched. She didn't push. She just watched me, waiting. The way she waited for vendors to name their real price after the fake one, patient and absolute, and something about the way she looked at me, like the answer actually mattered to her, like she wasn't going to fill the silence with something easier, made the not answering feel like its own kind of confession. The song ended. We stepped apart at exactly the correct distance, as though nothing had happened, as though we had not just stood in the middle of 200 strangers and asked each other a question neither of us had the courage to answer. "Thank you," Seraphina said, formal again, the ice reforming over whatever had cracked. "For the dance." "Any time," I said, and meant it more than I wanted to. I needed air after that. the kind of air that only exists outside a room full of candlelight and old money and unanswered questions. So I slipped through a side door onto a stone balcony overlooking the hotel's rain-soaked gardens. The storm had softened into a drizzle, and the city glittered wet and distant beyond the hedges. I hadn't been out there 30 seconds before the door opened again behind me. "You're supposed to be working the room," I said, without turning around. I delegated Aunt Constance to Robert. They deserve each other. Seraphina came to stand beside me at the railing, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched mine, both of us facing the gardens instead of each other, which made it easier, somehow, to keep talking. "You looked like you needed to leave before I did something unwise in front of 200 witnesses. Define unwise. I don't think I should, actually." She exhaled, and for once it didn't sound like a task on a list. Celeste used to accuse me of hiding at my own events. She wasn't wrong. I was always better at building the wedding than standing in the middle of one. "You're not hiding right now." "No," she said, and there was something almost startled in her voice, like she'd only just noticed. "I suppose I'm not." She glanced sideways at me, rain misting faintly in the light spilling from the ballroom windows. "Thank you for coming tonight. Truly. I know I asked for the wrong reasons, or at least reasons I wasn't honest about." "What were the honest reasons?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. "I didn't want to watch Celeste build a new life without feeling like I had one too," she said finally. "And somewhere in the last 3 years, without entirely meaning to, I started thinking of you as proof that I might." I didn't know what to do with that, standing on a stranger's balcony in a dress that cost more than my rent. So I did the only thing that felt true. I reached over and laced my fingers through hers, just for a moment, just long enough for her to feel it, and then let go before either of us had to name what it meant. She didn't pull away. She didn't ask me to explain it. We stood there another few minutes, not speaking, rain falling soft over the gardens, until the quartet inside struck up something bright enough to mean the cake was coming out, and we went back in together, her hand finding the small of my back again, like it had never left. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of toasts and cake and Diane Whitfield crying happily into her new husband's shoulder, but I spent most of it aware of exactly where Seraphina stood in the room, the way you're aware of a held breath. Celeste found excuses to drift past us twice more, murmuring something to her new fiancé each time, loud enough for us to catch fragments. So convenient, isn't it, hiring your own devotion? And each time Seraphina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and each time my hand found her arm without deciding to put it there, and each time she seemed to steady under the touch like a building settling on its foundation. By the time we left, the rain had thickened into a real storm, and Seraphina's driver pulled the town car up to the curb with an umbrella already open. We climbed in together, water drumming on the roof, city lights smeared gold and red across the wet windows, and for the first 6 blocks, neither of us said anything at all. "Celeste isn't wrong about one thing," Seraphina said finally, watching the window instead of me. "I am good at making people feel useful. I'm less good at the other part." "What other part?" "The part where you let someone matter to you without immediately calculating the cost of it." I turned to look at her fully. In the dim, moving light of the car, her face had none of the ballroom's performance left in it. She looked young suddenly, and tired, and lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. "You could try," I said, "letting someone matter." She turned her head, and her eyes found mine in the dark, and for one suspended second, I thought she might close the distance between our seats. Then the car slowed at a red light, and the moment passed, and she looked away first. "I'm not tired," I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. "And I don't think you are either." She looked at me again, considering, and something in her seemed to make a decision. She leaned forward and murmured an address to her driver that wasn't either of our apartments, and 20 minutes later we were sliding into a booth at an all-night diner 3 blocks from the harbor, still in our wedding finery, rain streaking the windows, a bored waitress setting down 2 coffees without asking whether we wanted them. "You bring all your dates here?" I asked, peeling off one earring that had started to ache an hour ago. "I've never brought anyone here." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed the warmth of it. "I used to come alone after events, when I couldn't stand to go home yet and sit with how quiet it was. It became a habit I never told anyone about. Why tell me? Because I didn't want tonight to end the way I usually end my nights. She looked down at the table, tracing the rim of her cup with one finger, still in her sapphire pendant, still every inch the Ice Duchess, except for the fact that we were sitting in a diner booth at midnight instead of a car headed toward loneliness. I keep almost saying something to you, Mira, and then deciding it's unwise, and then almost saying it again. You could just say it. I could. She didn't. Not yet. But she also didn't look away, and we sat there over lukewarm coffee and a shared plate of fries neither of us had ordered until nearly 2 a.m, talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. Her first event, my worst client, the dog she'd wanted as a child and never gotten, the 2 years I'd spent believing I wasn't worth choosing. She listened to that last part with a stillness that felt like its own kind of promise, though neither of us called it that yet. It was nearly 3 when her driver finally dropped me at my building, and she walked me to the door beneath a single umbrella, and for a long moment we simply stood there, rain drumming overhead, close enough that I could count the raindrops on her eyelashes. "Good night, Mira," she said, soft, and pressed the briefest kiss to my forehead instead of my mouth. Careful, deliberate, a promise held instead of spent. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed, replaying the dance in slow motion, her hand at my waist, the question she'd asked and I hadn't answered, and I told myself, the way I'd told myself 100 times before with 100 less complicated crushes, that this would pass. That Monday morning would arrive, and we would both put our armor back on, and this would become a story I told myself years from now about the time my boss and I got carried away at a wedding. Monday morning arrived exactly as I predicted, except nothing about it felt like armor. Seraphina walked past my office at 9 sharp, offered a clipped, "Good morning, Mira," and disappeared behind her own closed door for 4 hours. When I finally caught her in the hallway near the printer, she looked through me with a professionalism so total it felt like being erased. "The Whitfield invoice needs your signature," I said. "Leave it on my desk." She didn't look up from her phone. "Seraphina." "Yes?" I wanted to ask about the dance, about the car, about the question she'd asked, that I still hadn't answered even in the privacy of my own head. Instead, I said, "Nothing. I'll leave the invoice," and walked away, feeling like I'd failed some test I hadn't studied for. It went on like that for 2 weeks. Not cold, exactly. Seraphina was too controlled to be openly cold, but distant in a way that felt engineered, deliberate. A wall built brick by brick between the version of her I'd danced with and the version who signed off on my expense reports. And yet she started leaving her coat on my chair whenever it rained and I'd forgotten my umbrella, always with some brisk, unbothered explanation. "Sick employees are inefficient. Take it." Delivered without ever quite meeting my eyes. And yet I found, once, going through her planner to find a vendor contact, a small folded card tucked into the back pages. It took me a moment to recognize it as the paper dance card from the Whitfield wedding, the one guests were supposed to discard, with my name written on it in her precise hand under the single dance we'd shared, as if she'd needed to record that it had happened at all. And yet there was an elevator ride, the 2 of us alone, going up to the 14th floor for a client meeting, standing close enough that I could smell her perfume, something like cedar and rain, and neither of us said a word, and neither of us moved away, and when the doors opened we both stepped back at the exact same moment, like we'd choreographed it, like the dance had never actually ended, just paused. I spent the entire 14 floors staring at the numbers ticking upward, acutely aware of the 2 inches of space between her hand and mine, and when the doors finally opened she said, very quietly, "You still haven't answered my question," and stepped out before I could ask which one she meant, though we both knew. And yet, one evening when I was working late in the studio, surrounded by fabric swatches and buckets of unarranged flowers for the following week's events, sorting stems by color, the way I always did when my hands needed something to do while my head sorted through a problem, I looked up to find Seraphina standing in the doorway, not saying anything, just watching. She had a habit, I was learning, of appearing in doorways and saying nothing at all, as though the watching itself were the point. "You always separate the whites from the ivories," she said finally, stepping inside, running one finger along the edge of a rose that was, admittedly, cream rather than true white. Most people can't tell the difference. Most people haven't spent 3 years matching flowers to fabric samples under your supervision. It's not supervision, it's obsession, and I happen to share it. She picked up a stem of white ranunculus, turning it in the light, and I watched her hands, precise and careful, the same hands that had rested at my waist a week earlier like they belonged there. I used to do this myself, you know, before the company got too large for me to touch every arrangement personally. I miss it, sometimes. The part where you can fix something with your hands instead of a spreadsheet. You could still do it, nobody's stopping you. No, she agreed, setting the flower down with more care than the moment required. Nobody's stopping me at all. She looked at me across the work table, flowers and ribbon and swatches scattered between us, like a wall neither of us was quite ready to dismantle, and for a moment, I thought she might say something real. Instead, she said, "Don't stay too late," and left. And I stood there holding a handful of stems, wondering how long we could both keep almost saying things before one of us finally said them. The thing that finally cracked something open wasn't romantic at all. It was Reginald Vance, a client with more money than manners, planning an anniversary party at his seaside estate, who spent an entire site visit speaking to our catering staff like furniture. When he snapped his fingers at a young server and told her to hurry it along, I felt something in me go very still and very clear. "You don't get to speak to my staff that way," I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. The room went quiet. Reginald blinked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Excuse me?" "She's not deaf, and she's not furniture. If you have a request, you can make it politely, or you can make it to me, and I'll decide whether it's reasonable." My voice didn't shake. I was mildly astonished by that, given how hard my pulse was working. Reginald sputtered something about talking to management. I turned to find Seraphina already watching me, and there was nothing guarded in her face at all, just something open and startled and, unmistakably, admiring. "I am management," she said to Reginald, stepping forward smoothly, "and I agree with everything Miss Ellis just said. If you'd like to continue working with Rowe and Vale, that will not happen again." Reginald left in a huff of wounded dignity, and the server gave me a small, grateful smile, and Seraphina looked at me the entire drive back to the office like she was seeing something for the first time, though we'd worked together for 3 years. "You didn't have to back me up," I said, once we were alone in the car. "I wasn't backing you up," she said. "I was agreeing with someone who was right." A pause. "You're extraordinary when you're angry. Has anyone told you that?" Not in those words. No. They should have. She looked out the window, and I watched her jaw work like she was deciding whether to say something else. And then, quietly, "I've spent 3 years watching you fix things for other people. I don't think I've ever seen you fight for yourself." The observation landed somewhere tender and unguarded, close enough to Devon and every year I'd spent believing I was easy to overlook, that I had to look away first. A week later, I came down with a fever that kept me home for 2 days, miserable, buried in blankets, ignoring 3 separate emails I was too sick to answer. On the second evening, my buzzer rang. I opened the door expecting a delivery, and found Seraphina Rowe standing in my hallway in jeans. Actual jeans, the first time I'd ever seen her out of tailored fabric, holding a paper bag that smelled like ginger and chicken broth. "You didn't answer the vendor email," she said, like this explained anything about why she was standing in my doorway at 8 at night. "I have a fever, Seraphina, not a coma." "I know. I called your emergency contact information from your file to check you weren't dying alone in here, and then I felt strange about having done that, and then I decided the appropriate correction was to bring soup." She held up the bag like evidence. "This is not me overstepping. This is basic professional concern. You drove across the city with soup because of basic professional concern. Don't argue with a sick person's HR accommodations." But her mouth was doing the almost smile thing, and when I stepped back to let her in, she came, setting the soup on my counter with more care than the task required, glancing around my small apartment like she was cataloging it, the mismatched mugs, the plant I kept forgetting to water, the framed photo of my mother on the bookshelf. "This is very you," she said. Is that a compliment? It's warm, lived in. It looks like someone actually exists here, instead of just performing existing. Something wistful crossed her face before she smoothed it away. My apartment looks like a hotel suite. I've lived there 6 years. I sat at my small kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, watching her ladle soup into a bowl like it was a task she needed to get exactly right. And I thought about Celeste's word, appointments, and wondered how a woman who built perfect weddings for a living had never once built anything soft for herself. Why did Celeste say what she said? I asked. About you treating people like appointments. Seraphina's hands stilled over the bowl. For a long moment, I thought she might deflect, the way she deflected everything uncomfortable. But instead, she pulled out the chair across from me and sat, folding her hands on the table like she was steadying herself for something. We were together for 4 years, she said. I built this company during those years, from nothing, working 18-hour days, missing dinners, missing anniversaries, telling myself I was building something for both of us. She told everyone, eventually, at a party full of people whose opinions I still, humiliatingly, cared about, that I loved my business more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong. I didn't know how to do both. I still don't know if I know how to do both. She looked up, and her eyes were very steady, very honest, in a way I hadn't seen from her before. I built Rowe and Vale to prove her wrong about my capacity for devotion. I'm not certain it worked. I think I just got better at appointments. You drove across the city with soup, I said gently. That's not an appointment. No, she agreed, quiet. It isn't. She left 20 minutes later, before either of us could say anything that couldn't be walked back on Monday. But at the door she paused, hand on the frame, the same posture she'd had that first night in my office. Feel better, Mira? She said, and there was something in the way she said my name, soft, deliberate, that stayed with me long after the door closed behind her. 2 weeks after the soup, Rowe and Vale hosted the rehearsal dinner for another client, a smaller, quieter affair at a private dining room downtown. And because the client had specifically requested the team from the Whitfield wedding, Seraphina and I found ourselves seated beside each other again, close enough that our knees brushed under the table, both of us pretending it was coincidence. This is starting to feel like a pattern, I murmured, over the second course. Clients ask for consistency. It's a compliment to our work. Is that what we're calling it? She didn't answer, but her hand found mine under the tablecloth, brief, deliberate, gone before the next course arrived, and I spent the rest of the dinner with my pulse, doing something entirely unprofessional. Halfway through the toasts, the groom's sister leaned across the table and asked, with the particular bluntness of someone 3 glasses of wine deep, whether Seraphina and I were together, and I watched Seraphina consider the question with real weight this time, not the smooth deflection from the Whitfield wedding. We're figuring that out, she said finally, and it was the most honest thing either of us had said to a stranger about the two of us, and it sat warm in my chest for the rest of the night, warmer than it had any right to, given that we still hadn't said it plainly to each other. Afterward, walking to our cars in the cool evening air, she stopped me with a hand on my arm. I meant that, she said. What I told her. We are figuring this out. I don't want you to think I've decided anything without you. You reassigned my seating chart access for a month after the wedding, without asking me first, I pointed out. Forgive me for being cautious about your definition of figuring things out together. Fair, she said, and the honesty of the admission, no deflection, no armor, was its own small gift. I'm trying to be better at that. It doesn't come naturally to a woman who spent her whole career deciding things unilaterally and calling it leadership. You're allowed to be a work in progress, Seraphina. You just have to actually let me see the progress instead of hiding it behind a closed office door. She looked at me for a long moment under the streetlight, something unguarded moving behind her eyes, and I thought, not for the first time, that whatever this was between us, it was going to take both of us a while to learn how to hold it without flinching. The rooftop happened 3 weeks later, on a warm evening after a brutal day, a corporate gala gone sideways, a caterer who'd shown up 2 hours late, Seraphina snapping at a junior coordinator in a way I'd never seen her snap at anyone, and me following her up to the studio's rooftop garden afterward because someone needed to check on her. and I refused to let it be no one. She was standing at the railing when I found her, city lights spread out below, her shoulders rigid in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with holding something in. "You were unfair to Priya today," I said, because someone needed to say it, and I had apparently decided it would be me. "I know. She's 24 and she's terrified of you." "I know, Mira." Her voice cracked slightly on my name, the first genuine crack I'd heard in weeks of careful distance. "I know I was unfair. I've been unfair for 3 weeks. I've been distant and short, and I've made this entire building walk on eggshells because I don't know what to do with the fact that I danced with you at a wedding, and it wasn't strategy at all, and I have spent every day since trying to convince myself it was." The confession hit me somewhere unguarded. Why does it matter if it was strategy? "Because you work for me." She turned to face me fully now, and the ice was gone entirely, replaced with something raw and afraid. "Because I am your employer, and you are 29 years old and brilliant, and you deserve someone who can want you without a power imbalance sitting in the middle of it like a landmine. Because Celeste was right that I turn people into appointments, and I refuse to do that to you. So instead, you decided to just shut me out? Treat the dance like a mistake? I decided to protect you from myself. Did you ever consider," I said, stepping closer, my pulse loud in my own ears, "asking me what I wanted, instead of deciding it for me?" She looked at me like I'd struck her. "What do you want?" "I want you to stop treating the dance like a strategic maneuver you regret. I want you to admit that you asked me to dance because you wanted to, not because Celeste was watching." "I have never once needed strategy to want you," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, and something in her face cracked open completely, 3 weeks of careful distance collapsing at once. "I have wanted you since long before that wedding. I have wanted you in ways that terrify me, because I don't know how to want something and also protect it. I only know how to want things and lose them, and I would rather lose you as an employee I keep at arm's length than lose you as something I actually let myself love." I closed the distance between us. I kissed her because I chose to, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wanted something enough to walk toward it, instead of protecting myself from it. Her hands came up to my face like she'd been waiting a very long time to be allowed to touch me like this, and the kiss was shaking and desperate and much softer than I expected from a woman made of so much ice. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing like we'd run somewhere. "We can't," she said, forehead resting against mine, eyes closed. "Not like this. Not with things the way they are at work. I know. I need to fix it. Properly. Before this becomes anything else." "I know," I said again, and meant it, even though every part of me wanted to argue. She kept her word faster than I expected. Within a week, I found myself formally reassigned to report to Aaron Castellano, the studio's other senior director, with a note from HR about structural realignment that I knew with total certainty had been engineered by Seraphina personally. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt hollowed out, humiliated in a way I recognized from Devon's departure, the particular sting of being handled, managed, filed away. I didn't see Seraphina for 6 days. When I did, in a hallway, she was formal, correct, distant in the old way, and something in me that had cracked open on that rooftop slammed shut again. "You reassigned me without asking," I said, low, so no one else would hear. "I protected your career. You made a decision about my life without consulting me, again. Mira, I don't need protecting from you, Seraphina. I needed you to talk to me." I walked away before she could answer, and for 2 more weeks we existed in the same building, like 2 people who had never danced at all, and I told myself, again, that I had been a convenient appointment after all, easily rescheduled, easily set aside, once the inconvenient part of wanting me had to be managed. I found out, much later, from Priya of all people, that Seraphina had come into the boutique alone one evening during those 2 weeks, and stood for a long time in front of the midnight blue dress display, without buying anything, without saying much at all, before leaving with nothing but a quiet thank you. I found out from the junior coordinator I'd stood up for that Seraphina had personally approved a raise for her that same week, unprompted, no explanation given. I found out from my own eyes, catching her once through the crack of her office door, that she sat sometimes with her head in her hands when she thought the building was empty, the ice fully melted with no one there to see it happen. She was not punishing me. She was punishing herself, quietly, in all the ways she thought no one was watching, and knowing that didn't make the 2 weeks hurt less, but it kept me from believing, entirely, that I had imagined what happened on that rooftop. Della, predictably, had opinions. You kissed her. She kissed you back. And now you're both just marinating in misery 3 floors apart? It's complicated. It's not complicated, Mira. It's 2 people who are both too scared to say the actual sentence out loud. She softened, seeing my face. For what it's worth, I don't think she reassigned you because she doesn't want you. I think she reassigned you because she's never had anyone worth protecting before, and she doesn't know how to do it without also controlling it. I turned that over for days before the storm gave us both a reason to find out if she was right. The storm came, literally and otherwise, 3 weeks later, the night of the Ambrose Kelly wedding at a glass-walled estate on the coast, 600 guests, a governor's daughter among them, and a hurricane that had been downgraded to a tropical storm exactly 1 hour before it decided to make landfall anyway. The tent collapsed at 6. The flowers, shipped in from 3 states away, arrived wilted and half-drowned. The power flickered twice, and then held on a generator with a will of its own. Aaron, my new director, froze completely, and I watched, in real time, the entire event threatening to become the kind of disaster that ends up in industry newsletters with our company's name attached to it. I did not freeze. I moved the ceremony indoors to the estate's library in 11 minutes flat, rerouted the florist's remaining stock into smaller, tighter arrangements that photographed better anyway, got the string quartet playing acoustic in the front hall to cover the sound of the storm, and talked the bride's mother down from a full breakdown using nothing but calm certainty and a glass of water, which I had apparently learned from someone. I sent 2 junior coordinators to raid every candle and lantern in the estate's storage closets, because if I couldn't give the bride a tent full of fairy lights, I could at least give her something warmer than emergency generator fluorescence. I rewrote the timeline 3 times in the space of an hour, blue ink smudging under the sweat on my palm, and somewhere in the chaos I realized I wasn't scared at all. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was good at, and for once, I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to be good at it. Seraphina arrived 40 minutes in, soaked from the parking lot, and found the entire event not just salvaged but somehow more beautiful than the original plan, candlelit and intimate against the storm outside the library windows. She found me in the hallway, adrenaline still humming through me, and looked at me the way she'd looked at me after the Reginald Vance incident, except more so, except like something had finally, fully clicked into place behind her eyes. "You did this," she said. "I did this. Without me, I didn't need you to fix it, Seraphina. I just needed you to trust that I could." Celeste, of all people, was among the guests, a friend of the groom's family, unfortunately, and found us in that same hallway minutes later, wine in hand, smile sharp. "Impressive save," she said to me, before turning to Seraphina. "Though I suppose you'd know all about hiring competent people to manage the parts of life you can't handle yourself." I watched Seraphina's face, waiting for the old flinch, the old retreat behind ice. It didn't come. "Mira isn't someone I hired to manage my life," Seraphina said, clear enough that 2 passing guests turned their heads. "She's someone I love, and I've spent months being a coward about saying that out loud, because I was so afraid of repeating old mistakes that I made an entirely new one. So thank you, Celeste, genuinely, for reminding me what silence costs." She turned fully away from Celeste then, toward me, like the other woman had simply stopped existing. "I am done being careful with the truth, Mira. I should have been done a long time ago." Celeste, for once in her engineered life, had nothing clever to say. She left. I barely noticed. "Say the rest," I said to Seraphina, my voice unsteady. "Whatever you were building up to just now, say all of it." She took my hands in both of hers, right there in the hallway, storm rattling the windows, candlelight flickering off wet marble. "You write your timeline notes in blue ink because you told me once that black felt too final. like a decision you couldn't undo. You hum, completely without noticing you're doing it, when you're arranging flowers you're proud of. At the Whitfield wedding, when we were dancing, you steadied my hand without either of us acknowledging it, because some part of you already knew I needed steadying before I was willing to admit it. You have made me feel, for the first time since I built this company out of spite and exhaustion, like less of a locked room and more of a person someone might actually want to stay in. I am not pretending anymore. I have not been pretending for a very long time, and I am sorry it took me this long and this many mistakes to say so without hiding behind a wedding, or a rooftop, or an HR reassignment. Are you still pretending? I asked, echoing her own question back at her, my voice breaking on it. No, she said, simply. Certainly. I haven't been pretending since the moment you asked me to breathe on that dance floor. I kissed her then, in a hallway smelling of rain and candle smoke, with the whole rescued wedding humming warm and golden behind us, and it felt nothing like the rooftop kiss. Not shaking, not desperate, just certain, arriving exactly where it had always been headed. What followed in the weeks after wasn't dramatic so much as deliberate. Seraphina met with HR and formally restructured the studio's reporting lines so that I would never again fall under her direct supervision, regardless of what happened between us personally, a decision she made before we told anyone, before we let ourselves be anything but careful. Aaron remained my director. Seraphina and I told the senior team together, plainly, without apology, and if anyone in the office had opinions about it, they kept them to themselves, because by then, everyone had watched the Ambrose Kelly Library rescue and understood exactly what I was capable of on my own. We took things slowly, the way two people do when they've both been burned by love that arrived too fast and asked for too much too soon. There were nights at my apartment that ended in nothing more scandalous than her falling asleep on my couch mid-conversation, her head against my shoulder, more at ease in my small lived-in space than she'd ever looked in her own hotel suite apartment. There were mornings I woke to find she'd already made coffee, moving around my kitchen with the same precision she brought to everything, learning where I kept things without being told twice. There was a night, months in, when she finally let me stay past the point of careful and controlled, and I learned that beneath all that composure was a woman who kissed like she'd been rationing herself for years and had finally decided to stop. Devin's voice, the old one, the one that told me I was easy to love and therefore easy to leave, got quieter with every week that Seraphina chose me, not out of convenience, not because I happened to be standing nearby when she needed a +1, but on purpose, again and again, in small, deliberate ways. She chose me when she carved out actual evenings, phone off, just for us. She chose me when she told her mother about me, when she introduced me at industry events not as her coordinator but simply as Mira, no qualifier needed. She chose me when Celeste's name came up at a dinner months later, and Seraphina didn't flinch at all, just reached under the table and found my hand like the old wound had finally, fully healed. 9 months after the Whitfield wedding, Rowe and Vale hosted the wedding of one of Seraphina's oldest clients at the very same converted train station ballroom, gold light and white roses and rain streaking the tall windows in almost exactly the pattern I remembered. This time I wasn't a borrowed +1, smoothing over an awkward evening. I had designed half the event myself, my name on the vendor sheets, my blue ink notes in the production binder, and I walked into that ballroom in a dress I had chosen entirely for myself, deep emerald this time, because green had become, somewhere along the way, ours. Aaron still ran my day-to-day work, and I'd been promoted twice since the Ambrose Kelly storm, leading my own small team now, and if anyone in the industry whispered about the coordinator who'd ended up with the Ice Duchess, they mostly whispered it with envy rather than scandal, because we had done the hard, unglamorous, deliberate work of making sure nothing about it could be called improper. Seraphina had spoken to the board herself, plainly, months earlier, laying out every structural safeguard she'd put in place before either of us had said the word love out loud. Nobody argued with her. Nobody ever really did. Celeste had not been invited to this particular wedding, a fact Seraphina mentioned exactly once, lightly, like a door quietly closed rather than slammed. I don't think about her anymore, she'd told me that morning, fastening the clasp of a new necklace at my throat instead of her own, a small, deep green stone that matched the dress. Not the way I used to. She taught me what it feels like to be loved conditionally. You taught me the difference. I found Seraphina near the same spot we'd stood a year before, and there was nothing guarded left in her face at all. Nothing performed, just open and certain and unmistakably glad. "Dance with me," she said, holding out her hand, the quartet sliding into something slow. "Like we're dating?" I asked, teasing, remembering. She pulled me close, her hand settling at my waist exactly where it belonged, no calculation left in the placement of it at all. "No," she said, low, against my ear, warm instead of careful. "Dance with me like you know I'm yours." We turned slow circles under the gold light. Rain against the windows, no audience to perform for this time. Nothing pretended, nothing held back. I rested my head against her shoulder and felt her exhale. Easy, unguarded, the way she only breathed now when she was certain no one was going to take this away from her. Later that night, long after the last guest had gone home and the storm had finally worn itself out over the harbor, we stood together on the balcony of my apartment, her jacket around my shoulders because I'd forgotten mine at the office, both of us too wired from the day to sleep. She told me, quietly, about the version of herself that had existed before Rowe and Vale. Younger, softer, less armored, a woman who had once believed love could be built the same way you build a wedding, with enough care and attention that nothing was left to chance. She told me Celeste had taught her that care alone wasn't enough, that you also had to choose the right person to spend it on, and that it had taken her 4 wasted years and 1 wet, gold-lit ballroom to understand the difference. "I used to think being loved and being useful were the same transaction," she said, watching the last of the storm clouds break apart over the rooftops. "You've spent a year very patiently proving me wrong." "It wasn't patience," I said. "It was just true. You were worth waiting for, even when you were being impossible about it." "I'm aware I was impossible. Extremely." She laughed, real and unguarded, the sound I'd first startled out of her on a dance floor a year before, and pulled me against her side, and we stood there until the sky cleared completely, until there was nothing left between us but the quiet, ordinary certainty of 2 people who had finally stopped protecting themselves from each other. Some love stories begin with a confession whispered in candlelight. Ours began as an act in a crowded ballroom, a favor between a nervous coordinator and her impossible guarded boss, and it took a wedding, a storm, a rooftop, and the courage to finally stop pretending before it became the truest thing either of us had ever built. I used to believe that being easy to love meant being easy to leave. Seraphina taught me, one deliberate choice at a time, that the opposite was true, that the easiest love to trust is the one that keeps choosing you on purpose, long after the performance has ended, and there's no one left to perform for but each other. Outside, the rain kept falling against the tall windows, soft and steady, and inside, under the gold light, we kept dancing, no longer pretending, no longer careful, simply, finally, home.